Greetings, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our panel discussion. Does the Sabre rattle? Will and victory in Europe? Now, as the conflict in Ukraine has entered its second year, the ongoing Ukraine war is being considered as one of the largest conflicts since the conclusion of the Second World War. Now, it is no longer limited to traditional contours of a war, but with widespread and long lasting implications for Europe and the whole wide world. First, we will be beginning by introducing our panel speakers. Now, we have with us Ms. Barbara, who's Communications Advisor from NATO, Dr. Vlad, who's Associate Professor of Sustainable and Urban Development at the University of Oxford, Dr. Erhard Kemp, Professor of Criminal Law, University of West of England, Bristol, Dr. Jenny, who's a Senior Lecturer in International Relations from Aberystwyth University, and Dr. Precious N. Chatterjee, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Studies at the Open University, UK. Now, with that being done, I would first come to Dr. Vlad, right? Now, given the long-lasting nature of the Russia-Ukraine war, where do you see the economic recovery for Ukraine heading towards, and what steps do you think can be taken to resolve this issue?
Right. So it's a great question. I think we should be always thinking about the future, not just the current state of affairs. The a number of international agencies, including the World Bank, European Commission, the United Nations, also the Ukrainian government, and a number of other experts have recently been assessing the damage that has been done to Ukraine during the large-scale invasion since the 24th of February 2022. And the current bill that the war has kind of accumulated in terms of economic loss and also direct damage to housing, transport, commerce, industry, energy, agriculture, all the kind of affected sectors have so far reached almost, according to the World Bank figures, almost $500 billion, out of which 152 billion is direct damage. And the Kiev School of Economics have also counted a similar amount of damage, $155 billion of direct damage, including a quarter of a million housing units destroyed, 211,000 plus vehicles destroyed of all types, 16,000 transport units, almost 4,000 schools and kindergartens, 1,300 plus hospitals, almost 500 private firms and various other organizations. So the damage has been quite enormous. The next steps is, of course, the next steps include assessing the availability of funds, and at the moment, this is amongst the biggest problems, given that although we have 300 billion of US dollars of Russian assets been frozen in the West, which would come in handy to cover at least some of the direct damage. The conversations so far haven't reached the state international law whether those assets could be confiscated, and hence that is probably currently one of the biggest issues.
All right. So, given your even expertise in the urban development, right? But then I would come to it later in terms of what sort of things that lie ahead for Ukrainian cities, right? But having highlighted the numbers that you've highlighted, even from the World Bank regarding the destruction, economic destruction that Ukraine is facing, that brings me to my question to for Ms. Barbara, right? So what has been happening about the war is that we've witnessed numerous NATO members, right, on their individual basis, they've sent a lot of military assistance or significant military assistance to Ukraine over the course of this entire war. Now, in some instances, some of the NATO members have also sent in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Now, with that being said, do you think that establishing a NATO-Ukrainian Council can that really help what the members are they're trying to do in terms of collectively helping Ukraine, and what sort of things in terms of humanitarian assistance is NATO looking to provide to Ukraine?
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. And very pleased to be part of this very important discussion. I'll probably go a little bit backwards to explain a little bit NATO's position towards Ukraine and the various forms of support we have been providing to our neighbor. The last month marked the second year of Russia's war of aggression. And this war has brought unimaginable losses to Ukraine, losses of human lives, but also economic and financial losses and destruction of its infrastructure, as Professor Vlad mentioned. But let's also not forget about the ecological devastation and much of many other other damages to a sovereign country on the European continent. So Russia has shattered peace in the Euro-Atlantic area and gravely altered the security environment. And we can go a little bit broader into that in the next question. Now, when it comes to NATO's stand, we have provided from day one both the political and the practical support to Ukraine. By the political support, what we mean is that we are helping Ukraine to uphold its right to self-defense, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. And on the practical level, we as NATO, as an organization, have been providing non-lethal military aid to Ukraine. The allies have already pledged about 500 million euros, including things like fuel, medical supplies, demining equipment, night vision goggles, platoon bridges, etc., etc. And then we have individual member states that provide Ukraine with both financial, humanitarian, and military support, including military lethal equipment. And this is done either bilaterally or through a US-led Ukraine Defense Contact Group. And then, of course, we also have, let's not forget, the European Union as another entity which provides all of this assistance to Ukraine as well. Now, at the Vilnius summit last summer, so that is our highest level meeting on the level of heads of states and governments, the allies have agreed a package for Ukraine, which consists of three elements. First one, they agreed a multi-year program of assistance to help Ukraine to transition from the Soviet era to the NATO equipment, NATO standards and operability, and that we already see, of course, happening on a daily basis. Secondly, we upgraded our political ties through the NATO-Ukraine Council, so this is what you referred to. The NATO-Ukraine Council is actually a platform for crisis consultation and decision-making, where both the 32 member states of NATO and Ukraine sit at a table as equal partners. And each side can bring to the council meeting their own agenda that they want to discuss. So it is really a political consultation body. And the third element was that we reaffirmed to Ukraine that it will become a member of NATO when allies agree and the conditions are met. So this strong package for Ukraine is created in order to move Ukraine closer to NATO. And the last point, perhaps, on this that I would make is, of course, that the situation on the battlefield today is very, very difficult. So this makes it even more important to continue to step up our support to Ukraine, again, through NATO or through the individual military assistance that the allies are contributing. And I will probably conclude with a quote that my Secretary General uses, that support to Ukraine is not charity, it is an investment in our own security. Thank you.
All right. I think you've made quite a strong point in terms of how NATO is looking to, support Ukraine when it comes to the war, through the means of either the court or even saying that how NATO is willing to take in Ukraine as a member, right? Now, with that, I would like to come to Professor Erhard, and then I would want to ask you about. So there was this legal judgment by the International Court of Justice in 2022, wherein they asked Russia to withdraw its troops, right? Now, having said that, uh, that did not happen. So, what do you think? Are there any legal implications for Russia for not following that judgment? And what sort of legal remedies lie ahead when it comes to this war?
Of course, the International Court of Justice was approached, and we've seen last 2 years ago when Ukraine was invaded, that Ukraine exercised all kinds of legal avenues: the European Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, indeed also the International Criminal Court. But it is the focus of the International Court of Justice that is the subject of your question. And the way that Ukraine approached the court is interesting, because we may remember that prior to the invasion of 2022, Russia, of course, invaded Ukraine way back in 2013 already. So, in a sense, it's an ongoing occupation. It was only intensified in 2022. So that's the sort of broader context. And Ukraine argued in 2022, after the massive invasion of February 2022, that Russia invaded Ukraine under a false pretext. Namely, Russia accused Ukraine of committing the crime of genocide against certain minorities in the Donbas and other regions. And so Ukraine argued that Russia cannot use armed force in this way. The UN Charter is clear: armed force can only be used on two bases, namely self-defense or under Security Council authorization. None of those two bases were present. And the International Court of Justice in 2022 essentially agreed with Ukraine in all respects. So Ukraine asked for provisional measures, and the court, the ICJ, agreed with Ukraine, namely that Russia should immediately withdraw its troops. Why? Because there was no legal basis for Russian troops in Ukraine, neither under the UN Charter, which was not really the subject of the application. It was the scope of the Genocide Convention. And with a very creative legal argument, Ukraine was able to convince the court that Russia used a rhetoric around false accusation of genocide in the Donbas and other regions as a pretext to invade Ukraine. So on that, the court agreed with Ukraine. Now, the provisional measures were granted to Ukraine. And that brings us to your question, but what happened then? Obviously, we all know the answer. Russia stayed on in Ukraine, and in fact, Russia is still in Ukraine and is escalating the war in many respects. So it is clear for anyone who watched the news and who are vaguely familiar with the facts that Russia simply ignored the court order. So from an enforcement point of view, the ICJ were apparently not successful in that sense. But we must remember, and with that I conclude, ICJ judgments rarely have immediate practical effect. Often it is the case that its effect is at the diplomatic level. And one of the consequences of the ICJ decision was that it provided countries with legal ammunition, so to speak, to start to isolate Russia. For example, to kick Russia out of the European Council instruments on various human rights frameworks. It provided that legal cover for countries to start to put pressure on Russia. But unfortunately, the only direct way to enforce ICJ decisions is the Security Council. And of course, we all know Russia sits on the Security Council as a veto-wielding permanent member. So in that sense, we are still looking for ways to enforce the ICJ decision effectively.
All right, Professor. So, you highlighted the Genocide Convention and even the UN Charter, and that is something apart from the judgment of the ICJ, and that is something that I would want to ask you more about. But then, I'll come across and then we talk about the conventions as well. Now, that brings me to Professor Precious. Now, your research focuses on these interesting interplay of concepts like communication, perception, identity, security, right? So, from the context of Russia, what factors do you think that these factors contribute to Russia's use of soft power or even propaganda when it comes to using these concepts as instruments of its foreign policy?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me today. So, when we talk about soft power, essentially what we're referring to is the use of influence to achieve your foreign policy aims. And generally, what that demands is rather than force, is some sort of attractive potential. Often that's related to values, it can be, or it can be to do with identities, making it seem like there are similarities between you and other countries. And then the idea is that if you have shared values or if you have shared identities, then maybe you also have shared interests. So, in order to try and get other countries to see the war the way that Russia sees the war, of course, there is certainly an attempt to wield so called soft power. The problem is that soft power isn't just a resource that you can kind of measure and deploy. It's something that's very much related to the relationships between countries. So it looks different between different countries. Now, the classic and most important example of this in the case we're talking about is that Russia's aggression in Ukraine has essentially eroded any of the potential for soft power it might previously have wielded in Ukraine. It's become entirely, it's had entirely the reverse effect, where we see formerly Russian speaking Ukrainians switching to Ukrainian language as a sort of political statement, and this kind of thing that really erodes the power of Russia's kind of so-called attractive force. Similar issues we've seen in a split between within Eastern Orthodoxy, whereby the kind of Moscow-backed church has been essentially kind of forced out of any position of influence in Ukraine. So the other side of this is obviously, as I say, it's relational. So if we think, okay, what about other countries? Well, beyond Ukraine, Russia is trying to cultivate some sort of soft power or attractiveness with other countries that might see the conflict in the same light as it does. So often this is to do with emphasizing certain values. And there are kind of two key sets that I think it's tried to promote in its international messaging. The first set of those values is the so-called traditional values. So painting Ukraine as basically an affront to traditional values and Russia as a representative of traditional morality, and using that to try and get buy-in essentially from various communities across the globe. So this is one of the narratives it's promoted to the far right across Europe. It's one of the narratives it's promoted in its social media engagements across various states in Africa. The second element of this is the idea that Russia's basically a counter-imperial force, and that Western imperialism is the real reason for the war in Ukraine, and Russia is basically fighting back against that and building on its sort of Soviet-era heritage as being an anti-colonial power, a so-called anti-colonial power, in as much as it doesn't take a lot of concentration to realize that its actions in Ukraine are in fact inherently imperial in nature, but nonetheless trying to appeal to that legacy and its long-standing relationships with various countries across the world that were kind of part of the broader movement against imperialism back in the day is one of the key ways that Russia attempts to cultivate this sort of soft power and buy-in.
All right. So, this is one of the most important aspects of the war in terms of how, the war is on what lines are the parties trying to justify the war, if that is the case, right? And you have a book That's an upcoming book that talks about the Russian identity, but that's something that we will come upon just slightly later. With that, it brings me to my question for Professor Jenny or Dr. Jenny. Now, when it comes to Europe, immigration or migration by, from areas has been a long-lasting trend that we have been seeing. But I want to talk to you about specifically this war, and in terms of what sort of effect is it having on Europe when it comes to any migrants or immigration that must be happening to Europe as a result of the war? What would you say on that?
I think the impact in Europe is different in different countries. I think certain countries like Germany and Poland have taken very large numbers of Ukrainians who've been fleeing from the war, and that has been the case from the very beginning. And other countries have taken fewer, and certainly Britain has not taken nearly as many, for example, as Germany or Poland have done. So I mean, there've been a combination of factors, I think, in those countries that have received Ukrainian refugees. On the whole, I think there's been a lot of welcoming of those people. There's been a lot of sympathy to them. But I think as the war has lasted, we've seen of some tensions growing, obviously. There are big questions about how long the war will last, about when these people can safely return home, although some have already begun to return or gone back for visits to maintain connections with their families. Among the refugees themselves, there are big concerns, about how they can maintain their family connections, how they can raise children who continue to speak Ukrainian and feel themselves connected to Ukrainian culture and history and so on. There's a big package of all of these kinds of questions. I think there's also, though, a knock-on effect when it comes to bigger questions of immigration and how these countries view different kinds of immigrants. And some of the biggest tensions and debates, I think, have arisen over the question of how these countries treat different kinds of immigrants. And so certainly in the UK, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, why have Ukrainians been welcomed with open arms when immigrants from other countries like Syria or Afghanistan not necessarily been welcomed? And certainly at the moment, there's a big effort by the Conservative government in the UK to try and prevent more migrants from coming, particularly coming across the channel in small boats and all kinds of plans to try and send them to Rwanda and other kinds of things. So I think the issue of Ukrainian refugees has, in itself contains a range of different issues and themes. But I think it has also highlighted some real serious tensions in European societies about, who do they welcome and who do they not welcome, under what circumstances. And I think has exposed a lot of issues that really need to be addressed at a much more fundamental level.
One thing that I must say is that even though the question was mainly based around the Ukrainian refugees, if I could say that, the fact that you even talked about other refugees also highlights this fact that it's just not about refugees. The care is just not about refugees from Ukraine, right? The fact that you even tended to talk about, let's just say, maybe the UK or other refugees. So that really highlights the importance that you as a person and the region must attach to people from all across the region. Now, with that, I would come to Professor Vlad again. Now, having discussed all some of the implications of the war and what sort of effects that it has had, I want to sort of tap into your expertise into urban development, right? And I want you to tell us, in terms of what sort of effects does a war like a Russia-Ukraine war have on the cities, right? And what sort of impact does it have on the cities and the people that they're living in? What sort of difficulties do they face, and what would be done to sort of alleviate the stress that cities have been facing all across the borders?
Yes, thanks for this question. Obviously, the life is very difficult in Ukraine. My parents just spent the last 4 days hiding in the underground station in Kiev, and they're quite tired and rather angry about the bombardment and the missile attacks. Obviously, it's difficult to plan under war conditions. But most importantly, we have a number of cities that has been totally destroyed, right from the map. I would like to mention them just to remind everyone the devastation that happened. Over just the last 2 years, we had Popasna, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. We had obviously Bakhmut and Soledar totally destroyed. We had Mariupol, which was destroyed almost 40 to 50%, with the loss of 20,000 to potentially 100,000 civilian deaths. So we have a number of places that, well, Marinka, of course, totally demolished, and many other places. So we have quite a big challenge after the war is over to prioritize, right? We are talking about the 150 billion direct damage, which is a huge sum, but of course, no sum is big enough to recover a lot of loss. So a lot of prioritizing will have to take place, and we have to prioritize on cities that have to be rebuilt and have a potential to exist and have a potential for economic recovery. I've been currently involved in Mariupol Reborn, which is a great website as well, which is a fantastic initiative by Mariupol authorities, currently in exile in Dnipro, and they have already run the architectural and urban design competition with 4 fantastic plans for the architectural, the reconstruction of city. We're currently involved in doing economic modeling and economic strategy for the city, because obviously after the war is over, the main industry that the city has been based on, iron and steel industry, will be severely curtailed. Not to say lightly, probably will never recover from the devastation that happened. So those cities need a new reason to exist. On the positive side, and I would like to keep this conversation positive as much as we can, I've been doing some econometric and input-output analysis, and if we plug in 150 billion into the Ukrainian construction industry over, say, 10-year period of reconstruction time, that will generate, I would say, above 11% of GDP growth per year, every year for 10 years at least, just on the reconstruction effort itself. In addition, if you add the rest of the economy that is probably producing about 5% growth last year, we are thinking of two, maybe 3 times the size of the Ukrainian economy at the end of the reconstruction period. And we are looking at approaching the GDP per capita levels, the income levels of Ukrainian Western neighbors of Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. So, provided everything is in place, the end result and the tunnel in the end, the light in the end of the tunnel is pretty bright. So I would like to focus, obviously, a lot of our attention not just on the current war effort, but also looking ahead.
One of the most interesting things that you've highlighted over here is that, even though the war is ongoing right now, that people and institutions where you are involved, they are planning to not only sort of alleviate the stress as of now, but there's even, the fact to know that there's economic modeling in terms of, and growth is being projected in terms of cities, that what sort of growth lies ahead at the end of this tunnel. That's something, as you said, right, is extremely very positive to, know. Now with that, I would again come to Ms. Barbara. And then I would want to ask you about, so, on the latest entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO, right? If you're from NATO, it's almost impossible for me to not ask you this question. The thing is, because the entry has happened, how does that change the landscape in Europe? Not just from the perspective of the Russia-Ukraine war, but also from the overall geopolitical landscape. How does it change the picture? What do you say on that?
Yeah, thank you very much for these very specific questions. And as I mentioned already at my introduction about the changed security environment, this is one of them, obviously. And as we all know, actions have consequences. And one of the most consequential consequence of this particular situation is the membership of Sweden and Finland to NATO. And it's quite an extraordinary story, allow me to put it this way, because for decades, both Sweden and Finland have been very close partners of NATO with no ambition whatsoever of joining NATO. So as a direct result of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, these two Nordic countries have reversed a decades-old, and in case of Sweden, almost 200 years old policy of neutrality. And they decided to become members of NATO. So today we have 32 member states with two new very strong allies. And when it comes to their contribution, of course, they bring major capabilities, military capabilities to our alliance. For example, in case of Sweden, it's really cutting edge technologies of submarines and fighter jets, etc., etc. Also, they are both increasing their military spending. As you know, at NATO, we have a target of 2% GDP to be spent by our members on their defense. And both Sweden and Finland are either on the 2% or even with prognosis for more than 2% for this year and next year. So it's a rather formidable force. And it's also very important because for us as an alliance, as a collective defense organization, because it will simplify our overall defense planning, strengthening of our deterrence, particularly in the north and northeastern flank of our alliance, and frankly reinforcing our regional defense plans. And as some commentators have quipped, the Baltic Sea has now become practically a NATO lake. So this has extremely important geopolitical consequences. And the last thing perhaps I would mention with the membership of these two countries, particularly Finland, is that Finland shares 1,300 kilometers of land border with the Russian Federation, which means that NATO is now closer to Russian borders than ever before. And I dare say this is the exact opposite of what the Russian leadership actually wanted. So I think that the membership of Finland and Sweden are of extreme importance to us and to our work.
Right. One of the things that really, got, even though all of that you said had 100% attention of mine, was the fact that you said that how, as a consequence of the actions that have been undertaken, the Baltic Sea has almost become, in terms of metaphorically, like a NATO lake. Now, that's something that's, not only an interesting metaphor, but also very profound when it comes to geopolitics of the whole landscape. Now, with that, yes. With that, I would come to Professor Erhard. And then, previously in a conversation, we talked about the legal side of, or the legal implications of the war. And you talked about, so you also mentioned about the United Nations Charter or the Security Council. So now my question to you is, when Russia itself is a member of a Security Council or a profound member within the UN, and when if that's the case, and it's also one of the parties in the war, then how do we sort of navigate the war when it comes to, let's just say, the Security Council or even the larger UN? What do you say on that?
Yes, yeah, of course, Russia is an important member of the United Nations. We should not forget that. It's a permanent member of the Security Council. But I would want to link Russia's position in the international system, so to speak, with Ukraine's approach, which I think we should keep an eye on. Right from the get-go, Ukraine utilized the whole international system to its benefit. So as the victim state, as the less powerful state, Ukraine is utilizing law, international law, to the maximum that it can in its response to Russia. And we can see that the world, even though it doesn't look like it at the moment, the world is getting smaller for Mr. Putin. I mean, our colleague Barbara just mentioned that NATO is quite in opposition to what Mr. Putin wanted. NATO is expanding towards Russia. And at the same time, the world is getting smaller for Mr. Putin. Why do I say that? If you look at, for example, the International Criminal Court arrest warrants that is out, you look at the map of the world, there are many places in the world where Mr. Putin can no longer travel because of the ICC arrest warrants. And that includes most of Europe, many countries in Africa and South America and Australia and so on and so forth, Japan, South Korea. These are all UN member states, but they're also members of the International Criminal Court. Our colleague Precious, I think, discussed the effect of soft power, and law is a kind of soft power in that sense. International law via the UN system, via organizations like the International Criminal Court, and you know, over time it becomes clear that Mr. Putin will have to deal with that reality. Is that his world is getting smaller because of Ukraine's very effective use of international law in that sense. And you know, we can look at the short term. That is true. Russia is still dominating some of the UN structures where it has presence, like the Security Council, clearly because of its veto power. But there are areas of the international system where Russia cannot dominate, where international law is playing a role and is making the world smaller for Mr. Putin. And there's even talk of creating, you know, ad hoc criminal tribunals in conjunction with the International Criminal Court to ultimately hold Mr. Putin responsible for this crime of aggression. So I think if we take everything together, then it's clear that the UN system plus structures like the International Criminal Court can be utilized to great effect. And I want to end with one of the areas where Russia, of course, wanted to create a kind of a counter narrative is around structures like BRICS. We haven't mentioned BRICS yet. Where I come from, South Africa is a member of BRICS, and Mr. Putin couldn't even travel to the BRICS summit of 2023. Why not? Because of the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, South Africa being a member of the ICC. So, you know, Russia is powerful, and yet at the same time, we can see inch by inch, the international system is creating all kinds of limitations for Russia and of course its leader, Mr. Putin himself.
All right. You mentioned about how the world is getting smaller for the Russian president, and that is something that I think people would want to see how what sort of implications does it have eventually when it comes to this war. Now, even though I would want to implore more onto that thought, but that's something that I'll do just a bit later, right? With that, I would come to Professor Precious now. So you have an upcoming book that talks about the riddle of the Russian identity, right? And that's how it's titled. And one of the thing is that Russian identity has been at the it has been at the core of whenever uh, uh, to sort of explain their actions at the World Forum, right? Very famously, it was former Prime Minister Churchill. He even talked about the Russian identity during the Cold War or at the end of the World War. So, with that, I want to ask you about what are the areas that you have explored in your book? And if you could give us the crux about what is the story about the Russian identity and why is it that it's invoked so much when it comes to explaining the actions that Russia often takes at the international front.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. I think one of the most significant things to kind of get clear at first is that a state's identity on the international stage can often be seen as a shorthand for the types of choices it makes and the types of policies it favours. And you can see that as an intention to play a particular role in the wider world. So I would say that in general, the most significant aspect of Russian state identity that has kind of recurred over time and has been a very consistent feature of Russia's approach to foreign policy, back even through Soviet times, even to the times of Russian Empire, is the idea that Russia is a great power. This is the kind of most well-known element of Russian national identity and of Russian self-conception, which essentially means that it's exceptional, it's special, it has a greater purpose in the international arena, and that's kind of backed up by military capacity. And in some ways, there's this idea that this special status almost makes it legitimate to do things or make calls or take decisions that otherwise wouldn't be legitimate for other international players. So I think that's the first sort of contextual factor to take into account. Now, of course, Russia is not the only state in the international system that thinks of itself as exceptional, and we could talk about that if we wanted to, but I think it's probably not the most important thing here. The US has a very strong history of exceptionalism. But why it's important in understanding, I think, the kind of lead up to the war and kind of the behaviors that Russia has exhibited during this war is because identities are also relational. I think I mentioned that earlier, that it's not just something that exists on its own, but in relation to other players. And different identities come to the fore in different relationships. And, again, I could mention many of these, but I'll just focus briefly on two that I think are most helpful for what we're discussing now. So the first is the idea that Russia is basically the figurehead for a greater Russian identity. And this is relational to Ukraine and Belarus, where Russia essentially sees itself as the kind of the key part of that triangle, that Ukraine and Belarus are basically kind of lesser Russian nations, but part of a greater whole. And we saw that in Putin's essay prior to the war, and we've seen it in his thought previously. It's not like a new idea, but it certainly kind of legitimizes the idea that Russia has a special role to play, and that it's somehow legitimate to see these other nations as lesser and kind of at Russia's will, I suppose. The second, and it's great that you asked me this question just after Professor Kemp spoke, the second is the rising power identity, I think, which is quite important in a lot of ways, but especially when we're thinking about the broader geopolitical implications and the way that Russia's tried to manage its military engagement in Ukraine beyond the region. And this fits in with the idea that Russia's tried to present itself as a sort of counter-hegemonic power, as basically as a counterweight to Western institutional dominance in ways that it has thought have chimed with other countries' strategic priorities. And this idea was present in Russian foreign policy discourse well beyond the formal foundation of BRICS, by the way. It was very prominent throughout the 1990s, and there were a lot of kind of bilateral initiatives with India, with China, actually with Brazil. There was some interesting attempts to create bigger relationships there. And Russia has essentially rebranded this, using BRICS essentially as an excuse, and that converted a sort of economic moment into political capital, you could say. But basically, then there's the idea that this is a pushing back against Western dominance of international institutions. And now, again, as Professor Kemp said, actually, that's not an entirely accurate picture either. Russia has its legacy veto in the UN Security Council. It's not like it is a bit part player in international institutions at all. But kind of playing into that particular identity can help it to build coalitions or attempt to build coalitions. And I think that's been one of the kind of key strategies in Russian foreign policy, potentially now not as helpful now that Mr. Putin's world is becoming smaller, but certainly that has been a recurrent feature.
All right. Personally speaking, I look forward to be reading your book, right? I would say I'm very interested in terms of knowing, what sort of identity, that you must have explored in your book. Now, another thing that I must highlight in this panel is that, how the panel members, they are referring to each other, and like, what everyone is referring to, and taking up sort of cues from, each one. So that is something that's I really seem to like. With that, I would come to Dr. Jenny. So your research does not your previous research does not only talks about the Russian politics, but also about gender studies, right? Now, with that, what I would want to come to is, given the nature of the war, do you think that these two these two interplays can be juxtaposed, and what sort of effect does the war is having on women? What would you say on that?
Oh, I think the war is having a huge impact on women, whether you're looking at women in Ukraine, women in Russia. I mean, if I start with women in Russia, for example, I mean, Russia is has a very male-dominated political system. It's very hierarchical. You know, the major decision makers are all men, which is very clear to see if you watch any kind of news coverage of Russian leadership politics at all. But women serve a really crucial role as supporting players in a lot of ways, and we're seeing this very clearly in relation to the wives of many of the men who've been mobilized as a result of Putin's September 2022 mobilization order. So this has mobilized hundreds of thousands of men across the country, but mainly from areas which suffer from a lot of socioeconomic deprivation, areas which are often characterized by a majority of people who are not ethnically Russian. And a lot of the women, all of the wives in these families have begun to organize amongst themselves. They've begun to use social media. They've begun to sort of strategize, and not only to appeal directly to the government, for example, even a relatively small thing like asking for their husbands to be rotated back from the front, which they haven't been, but also beginning to make more political statements. And there's a particular group on social media who call themselves the Way Home Wives, and they have actually begun protests in real life every week at war memorials across Russia. They bring flowers, and they stand and hold signs saying "Return our husbands." And what they're calling for is not necessarily an end to the war. They're calling for an end to mobilization. And effectively, though, the way that Putin is running this war, an end to mobilization would mean an end to the war. Russia couldn't keep the war going in the way that it does without that. So I think women often in Russia often have a backseat role, but they nevertheless play an absolutely crucial role in holding families together. And they are beginning to put pressure on the government and to hold them to account, which is really important. If we think about women in Ukraine have been, again, holding things together in an amazing way. Many women have volunteered to serve in the armed forces. The numbers have been going up, the proportions have been going up, and women are now able to serve in all roles. Basically, all the restrictions have been removed from women in the Ukrainian military serving in combat roles. But also women have played a huge role in civil society. Both those women who have remained in Ukraine throughout the war take leading roles in, just organizing local, communities, looking after each other, but also raising funds to buy things and find donations for units at the front, all of these kinds of things. And of course, women who've left Ukraine because of the war, many of them have left with their families, with young children, and so they are, holding together their families, raising their families to remember that they're Ukrainian, to maintain those links back to their families at home and maintain the cultural links. So I think what we find is that women are not always in the front of our attention when it comes to news coverage of the war. It's a very sort of male-dominated event. But if you look carefully behind the scenes, you can see that they're doing an awful lot, and that an awful lot of the way that societies will develop, both in Russia and Ukraine, are going to depend on how these women respond and how they raise their children to look into the future.
As much as you highlighted the role that the women on either side, right, of the border they're facing, I think the way you put it, right, it sort of encapsulates the entirety of the role, which, as you said, right, they're holding it together. Uh, be that as it may, they're still holding it together, and I think that is what is one of the need or one of the most important things that's needed as of now. Now, with that, I again come to Ms. Barbara, and then I want to ask you about, given this war, has it changed NATO's perception of security, or in terms of what sort of red lines do they have when it comes to, conflicts in Europe? What would you say of that?
Well, clearly, it has had great ramifications, first and foremost for the Euro-Atlantic security, as we refer to it, simply because we have done the biggest reinforcement of our deterrence and defense since the end of the Cold War. We have agreed and approved our regional defense plans, which is something that has been lying for 30 years, locked in the cupboards of our military planners, and that has been now dusted off. We are doing plenty of exercises at the moment. We have the biggest military exercise since the end of the Cold War, with up to 90,000 troops. So absolutely, the ramifications are broad, both for our own regional security, but also for global security. Particularly for us, what happens in Europe also matters for the Indo-Pacific, and what happens in the Pacific matters for Europe, for us as well. That's why we are looking for partnerships far and near. And I think that might be perhaps an interesting topic for our next discussion of our relationship with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. So for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it at this.
Yes, all right. Since you've mentioned the sake of time, I will come to each one of you, right? And if you could give us your short insights onto the question, then that would be grateful. Now, from Ms. Barbara, I would come to Professor Vlad, right? So you told us about that there is that you're also involved in terms of economic modeling, in terms of growth is being modeled upon. Could you tell us something more about that as well?
Right. So effectively, we are with Mariupol Reborn. We are trying to figure out what the city should be doing after reconstruction, and also because Mariupol is the largest city that's been destroyed and still occupied. Before the war, it had about 400,000 people, and a lot of actually internally displaced people from Donetsk, Luhansk, and other areas of the Russian-occupied Donbas from 2014 to 2022. So we are looking at effectively trying to win the city out of the heavy industry, and quite a lot of really old industrial legacy that has been useful for a while. But it's part of that project funded by a European charity, European Climate Foundation, Malaria Foundation. We've been doing quite a large-scale project of actually trying to re-envisage Ukrainian main industry, which is iron and steel industry, without the use of fossil fuels. So we have a feasibility study that's currently under revisions in a major journal that effectively provides a case for total transformation of Ukraine's key industry using the renewable energy sources, and using obviously the iron ore deposits that Ukraine is very rich on. And the total bill for that, if you ask me, is over $60 billion for the total transformation over potentially 10 to 20 years. But the extra economic growth that the green steel industry will produce is 77 billion more than the black steel industry would produce. So effectively, the investment of that scale would generate not just growth, but actually more growth and better quality growth. So looking at cities and looking at particular industries, I think there's a lot of potential. And I'd like to mention that Ukraine's largest steel industry, a steel company, Metinvest, has earmarked 35 billion already for the investment to green steel projects. So effectively, half of the bill has been covered by a private investor currently working in Ukraine. So we're just looking. We just need ArcelorMittal to contribute the other half, and that will be great.
Interesting that you talked about the other half. With that, I think we're coming almost at the end of the agenda that we had for this panel discussion. But before we conclude, finally, if I could just have, remarks or concluding remarks from all of you in terms of what does the future hold, or how do you, personally see how the war is going to turn out in the future. So yeah, if we could have those concluding remarks, maybe let's start with Professor Precious.
I think one of the key things to remember about the war and its kind of future progress is that it's very much related to political will. And so this essentially means that messaging around the war remains extremely important. And the way even that we as a general public relate to messaging about the war is very important. So I think we have to pay particular attention to kind of what's being said and how it's being said, and how information can often be manipulated to create a particular impression that can then have actual ramifications on the ground in terms of how believable it seems that Ukraine could ultimately win, because it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's obviously why Russia invests a lot in its kind of media and soft power strategies, is to try and make that self-fulfilling prophecy work in its favor.
All right. Dr. Jenny?
I think it's important for us to remember as we look into the future that nothing is going to be the same as it used to be, as a result of this war. It's changed the way that Europe thinks about security. It's changed the structures that we've heard, but also it's really changed the relationship with Russia. And unfortunately, I don't think that relationship is going to bounce back and revert, regardless of how this war ends. And one indication of that, I think, is the efforts that are being made in Russia to encourage young people to think that war is necessary, and that war is going to be in their future. So I would encourage us to take the longer view and to recognize that none of us are going to be untouched by this conflict.
All right. Professor Arhan?
Yes, thank you. I don't know how the war will end, but what I can say from an international criminal law point of view is that the law is patient, and we have seen World War II era war criminals being prosecuted decades after the war has ended. So the law can wait, and the law will wait, and Mr. Putin cannot escape justice, and the many, many war criminals on the Russian side. But unlike Nuremberg and Tokyo, justice now will cover both sides. So to the extent that there are crimes on the Ukrainian side, that will also be punished. But clearly, Russia is responsible for this war. And what I can say is that the instrument of international criminal justice will be patient and will wait for the day that Mr. Putin and his co-conspirators and co-perpetrators are judged and tried, and if found guilty, punished.
Right. Dr. Vlad?
Well, on one hand, you can say that we surely will be fighting 12 months from now, and maybe even 24 months from now. That's probably a conservative estimate that everybody can make. At the same time, I'd like to kind of, inspired by conversation we had today, we need to remind everyone that the opposing party is, although the pretense is it's stable, it's strong, it's a war-driven economy, it's quite a fragile state and quite a rotten state in itself, as the mutiny of Prigozhin has shown, and also the recent terrorist attack in almost central Moscow have shown. The system is actually very fragile, and anything can happen any day that might end the war. So I am sort of, on the one hand, quite realistic about the long-term nature of it, but also quite optimistic about potential black swans or white swans.
Right. With that, we come to Ms. Barbara, and that's how we conclude this panel. Your ending remarks.
Thank you very much. I mean, from the perspective of NATO, all I can say is that the wars by nature are obviously unpredictable. But what we can do, and we need to do, and we do it on a daily basis, is to ensure that Ukraine is provided with the resources it needs in order to win this war. So that's the most important task ahead of us for weeks and days and months to come.
All right, then. With that, I think we come to the end of this discussion, and we're very grateful to each and every one of you. And we look forward to be hosting you again, probably not on the war. So that is how I will put it. And yes, thank you so much for joining in, and hopefully we host you soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the colleagues.